Made by Us is an exciting new initiative that's bringing together museums and historic sites all across the country in one shared goal: supporting, inspiring, and informing young people's civic engagement, powered by history. Young adults today are driving an agenda-setting conversation around democracy and America's future, and they're seeking out context and trusted information to help. Knowing our past is key to shaping our future. Made by Us connects millennials and Gen Z with the vast resources and expertise that cultural institutions have to offer. Led by some of the nation's most iconic institutions and supported by hundreds of history and civics organizations nationwide, our collaborative network captures history from across many perspectives and sources and brings it to the places young people spend time every day. We are a bridge, bringing history from museum cases and textbooks to bar stools, backyards, and the ballot. If you want history that informs your everyday life, be sure to stay up to date with Made by Us. Follow @HistoryMadeByUs on social media, and you can sign up for our email updates at historymadebyus.com.
Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. We're delighted to have you from home today. Through this foundation programming, we like to kick open the doors to the National Archives and its 15 billion records for the American public through these spirited conversations. Our guest speakers today will be taking your questions. So before we begin, we want to make sure you know how to ask questions. You don't have to wait to the end, and you don't have to wait for the teacher to call on you. We're going to be using the YouTube chat box. So to get a little practice, put your hometown and state. I see a few folks are regulars that are already doing that. We'd love to have you. Let us know where you're from and I'll give you a shout out later on. Civic literacy and education is a major priority of the National Archives Foundation. So I hope you enjoyed that brief video before we started from Made by Us. It is in a new and dynamic partnership that we're proud to be a part of. And as you'll see through this program, that the next generation is thirsty for ways to learn, connect, and participate in our democracy. So take a look at Made by Us. And now we move to a special message for our sponsor today, Ford Motor Company.
On behalf of Ford Fund, the philanthropic arm of Ford Motor Company, thank you for joining us as we honor and recognize the important role of African Americans in our nation's history. For more than a century, Ford has put the world on wheels, fostered innovation, and stepped up in times of need. From our historic $5 a day wage, regardless of race, to our contributions to the war effort during World War II, to the production of urgently needed medical equipment and PPE supplies to help combat the coronavirus pandemic, we are striving to build a better world for everyone, every day. That is why we are proud to partner with the National Archives Foundation and the National Archives and Records Administration to connect, educate, and inspire Americans to celebrate our shared history. We are especially pleased to support the Archives Fund for Rights and Justice and Black History Month programming, which brings known and lesser known stories of people of color to citizens across the nation and around the world, including how they have shaped our country's history and are laying a foundation for the future. We hope you are enlightened, encouraged, and inspired to share what you learn. For more information on Ford Fund's broader community investments, visit fordfund.org or follow us on social media. Thank you.
We're so pleased to have them as a partner for today's program. So I'm going to introduce our speakers now before we introduce the whole panel, just to give you a flavor of who you'll be hearing from today. We've got Maxim Thorne, the Managing Director of the Andrew Goodman Foundation, where every day he focuses on increasing young people's civic power in defending and expanding our democracy. Formerly, he was part of the NAACP, where he served with Julian Bond. He also was the vice president and COO of the Human Rights Campaign and the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. I know he's got a lot to tell us today about their work. Dr. Nancy Thomas directs the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University's Tisch College of Civic Life, the nation's leading research center on student political learning and participation in democracy. Her work and scholarship center focuses on higher education's democratic mission, college student political participation and voting. And she's going to be telling us about student voting patterns and trends drawn from her database of more than 10 million students. Tamia Folks is a junior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, majoring in journalism and political science. She's joining us as the campus ambassador of the Goodman Foundation. She's written for the Wisconsin State Journal and the Madison Commons. She's made appearances on the Oprah Winfrey Network and Meet the Press. And if I had to guess, she's most proud of her appearance on the University of Wisconsin's Badger Report. So as we start to get into this program, I couldn't think of someone else to better frame it than the iconic John Lewis.
The Constitution is a living document. It is not static. As citizens, we need to make it real, not just for some of us, but for all of us. The phrase "with liberty and justice for all" mean all. We're one people. We're one family. We're the American family.
The discovery of an individual's liberty is one of the foundational values of being an American citizen. America has been struggling to define the rights and justices associated with that liberty since the creation of its Constitution. From this struggle evolved the monumental Bill of Rights and 17 more amendments to define and protect our liberties. Over time, the amendment process has been tested by a nation whose national sense of liberty, equality, and the inclusion of all citizens evolved with turbulence and struggle.
When we were planning the March on Washington in August of 1963, I would hear Dr. King say things like, "We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we will perish as fools."
Freedom, true freedom, is not given by governments. Freedom is taken by the people. The people of America are becoming aware that this freedom to their fellow human beings, and I call them human rights, are theirs to give.
The issues that compel America to continue to define equality and fairness, I think it's innate. I really believe that it's in our soul, that we believe in freedom, freedom of the individual. We believe that humans have a right to peacefully coexist with fellow human beings.
So there are two monumental statues on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the National Archives building. One inscribed, "Study the past," the other, "What is past is prologue." The message is, we should be able to learn from our history so that we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over. And the role of the National Archives is to ensure that people have access to the records that demonstrate how those rights were achieved so that we can learn from those records.
With over 11,000 proposed amendments to the Constitution, and only 27 of those actually ratified, our pursuit of rights and justice continues to be a vibrant part of our democracy. It's up to every generation of Americans to own our democracy and continue this national dialogue of defining our personal liberties.
It is very, very important for all of us as citizens, for all of us as one people, to take ownership of our system of justice. This is our democracy. It belongs to all of us. We must talk about it. We must debate it. We have to continue to fight every single day. If we do not, we will go backward. We don't want to go backward. We want to go forward and complete our effort to create a more perfect union.
Okay, well, obviously we miss him, so articulate, and I'm sure you're all ready to jump in. Maxim, are you with us?
I certainly am.
Terrific. And if you want to turn your video on, we'll see you live. It's a great portrait of you, though. Looks like you're in front of the archives, actually. We're delighted. We're delighted to have you and join you. Have you join us and have the panel join us. This has been fun to prepare for, and I know that the story of the Andrew Goodman Foundation is very much intertwined with the story of John Lewis. Can you give us some background on the foundation, just to help people understand how we got to the conversation we're going to get to today?
Thank you, Patrick. It's a real honor to be participating in this esteemed program with the National Archives Foundation. And I'm just thrilled that you started with John Lewis. So for folks who don't know, John Lewis recruited Andrew Goodman, who was a 20-year-old college student, to become part of Freedom Summer 1964. And John has remained connected with the family and with his institution until his death last year. In fact, as you all probably know, Sunday, we commemorated the 1-year anniversary of John's death, as well as Malcolm X's death also on Sunday. Andy's first day in Mississippi, he, James Earl Chaney, and Nikki Schwerner were brutally assassinated by white supremacist domestic terrorists, the KKK, that included members of the police force. Their first day, their mission was to broaden the franchise so that African Americans, Blacks, could vote. This is a traumatic start to living Andy's legacy. Andy's parents founded the Andrew Goodman Foundation in 1966 to carry his mission and all that is important about what he did with James and Michael, and inform what future young activists could do. This story, however, is very complicated. So we are talking about Andrew Goodman because of the Andrew Goodman Foundation. But to understand this story is to understand American history and our system that has supported white supremacy. And why do we even think of Andrew Goodman and Nikki Schwerner and James Chaney? Well, frankly, it's because Andrew and Michael were white and killed by the Klan. You know, when Andy and Michael and James Chaney went missing, the FBI, after a lot of pressure, decided to undertake an investigation to figure out why these 3 young men disappeared. During that investigation, by the way, it took 40 days for them to find their bodies. They uncovered 9 Black bodies, young men, who had also been killed. 2 of them were in the Mississippi River. One was 19 years old. We almost never talk about the names of these young Black men who were also murdered in Mississippi. And we've had hundreds of young Black men and women and other people of color being murdered that never got the attention that Andrew and Nikki got. And so while we appreciate what an ally Andy was and Michael was, let's understand the sophisticated strategy that John Lewis and CORE and the NAACP and others used, which is white America will be empathetic to the stories of white young men and women if they were harmed in the way that Black people were harmed. because there'd been so many Black people who had been harmed and no attention whatsoever. And in fact, as I mentioned, even though they uncovered those bodies, the other Black bodies, no one even talked about it. It was hidden. It was hidden. It took 40 years for those other bodies to be investigated, the murders of those other people. So I just want to mention two names because I think I don't want to play into, this is 2021. I don't want to play in to the narrative of only the white hero of civil rights. This is a much broader narrative. It was strategic for sure to have a lot of white freedom writers, especially upper middle class, upper class white folks participate in Freedom Summer and be exposed to the story because the media would carry that story, and they did. So that's the brilliance of the strategy. Today, we have the opportunity to interrogate all of this story, and that's why I so appreciate the National Archives. Really understanding that things may have finally changed. Young people are still helping this democracy achieve its promise, that shining city on the hill, where we all share in our democracy. But it started a long time ago. So the two names I want to talk about is, and mention that they were killed. Their bodies were discovered in July. Andy, Mickey, and James Earl's bodies were discovered in August. Henry D, we don't hear about. And Charles Moore Case, we don't hear about. And the other 7 and more. So I want to honor that. I want to honor John. I want to honor Julian Bond. I want to honor Malcolm X and all those other martyrs that were just created during the insurrection. They're really important to our national story. This is Black History Month, but this is American history. And I think the Andrew Goodman story, the Mickey Schwerner story, the James Earl Chaney story is the quintessential story about how we are bending the arc of the moral universe towards justice and equity. So that's what our mission is. And that's what Carolyn and Robert Goodman tried to do when they founded this as a family foundation. We are no longer a family foundation, we're a public foundation. And our mission is still the same, to make young voices and votes powerful forces in democracy. And later on, whenever you like me to, I can tell you how we're doing that and how that strategy became so important to some of the major victories that occurred in 2020, and even in the Georgia runoffs.
Terrific. Well, thank you for sharing those stories, and all of the stories are important. Obviously, Andrew Goodman's legacy has a different trajectory because of the family and the foundation, but all the stories are, as you say, equally important, and for us to continue to discover our past and those who took a leadership role, even if they were never in the headlines. Well, let's talk about the work of the foundation today and young people. So I think that's what really sort of attracts me to your work is how you engage young people, just like Andrew Goodman was inspired to do that summer, and be on campuses and not in a, we're going to go help register kids to vote or we're going to help drive them to the polls. It's much deeper and more meaningful than that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Patrick, one of the things that has always been a problem. When young people, so 18 years today, so the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971. That's 50 years ago. And the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age for young people to 18. So people over 18 could vote if they were a US citizen. And that was the year that we had a number of young people who turned out to vote. We haven't seen that kind of turnout until last year, 2020. And so there was this myth that young people are not interested in politics. They don't vote because they don't want to, and all these other narratives. We believe that was false. And even in the age where young people have been subject to just false accusations that they're only interested in their video games and whatever else people say, you could tell from the conversations they have online, on Black Twitter, on Snapchat, on all TikTok, that they're engaged in this conversation. what was happening in our view is that they weren't connecting the issues that they care about to voting. And so we thought, how do we do that? One thing we knew we should not be doing is what some others thought they would do, or what campaigns do. Parachute in 60 days, 30 days, 90 days before an election, and think that young people would then suddenly, because you registered them and they signed on a clipboard, that they would vote. There had to be a lot of work, non-cyclical work, constant work, to ensure that young people develop that identity as a citizen and voter, and then connected all the issues that they care about: mass incarceration, climate change, LGBTQ justice, reproductive justice. We can go on, and see that our society, our democracy, would allow them to achieve what they wanted to achieve, because that connection was not being made. The other thing that we had observed, but few others, I would argue, had observed, is that there was a deliberate targeting, with like surgical precision targeting of young people so that they would not be able to vote. Voter suppression targeting young people. And we've known, obviously, the reason Andy went down to Mississippi was because they were trying to suppress the Black vote and the black people's inability to register to vote. So this is the history of America, denying Black people and others the right to vote. What we observed is that this was also being targeted at young people. And so why? Probably demographics. Young people seem to be more progressive. This generation, Gen Z, is the most racially diverse generation in American history. And so we began to notice terrible things happening, like Florida attempting to ban, and did in fact have a ban, on all early voting on any college campus. We couldn't get anyone to pay attention to this. Do you realize this was going to discriminate against every young person on a college campus? We couldn't get anyone to do the lawsuit. We tried to get the media engaged, and they didn't. So we went at it alone. Thankfully, we were very lucky to have a foundation that paid for this litigation, and some of the best lawyers in the world on this issue from Perkins Coie. Really grateful. And we won on the 26th Amendment, which says you cannot discriminate against young people or anyone 18 years and over. And this was clearly targeting young people to deny them the right to vote. Our success in 2018, and this has become precedent to be used around the country, allowed young people to have a strategy to protect and to frame what was happening to them in the attempt to deny them to vote. So no, it was not, oh, I'm so lazy, I'm so distracted. No, it was all these things that were being put in as obstacles to them to vote. Student IDs, no polling site on campus, having to produce a utility bill to prove, like I was in college, you were in college. I never got a utility bill from my college when I was there. So these things were told, unless you can produce a utility bill, you can't vote. Just crazy stuff. And they turned out at that time in record numbers. And as you saw, Congress changed and other districts changed and so forth. And then there was an avalanche or a virus of voter suppression targeting young people after 2018. And then we finally caught the media's attention. And we finally got a New York Times article, thanks Dan Levitt. It was so wonderful to finally have people recognize and be able to do what Andy, Mickey, and James were able to do, get the attention of the public focused on all of voter suppression, but particularly those affecting young people. And we did do that. And we also stayed on campuses. We stayed year round. We worked with, and you're going to hear from her later, Tamia Folks, who's ambassador to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We are in 26 states in Washington, D.C. right now, reaching about 2 million students. That's 93 campuses around the country, particularly in key states where there's a history of voter suppression and even more voter suppression coming down the pipe. In February, earlier this month, there were 166 bills, voter suppression bills around the country. Today, they're over, which is a few weeks later, we're still in February, to over 250 bills trying to suppress the votes of people of color and young people. You have to understand, there were, that is about I don't know, 10 times the voter suppression bills that were introduced in 2020, which was the record year of attempting to have voter suppression bills passed in these states. So imagine what we are facing with. That's why this is not an off year. Yes, the election was last year. Yes, Georgia runoffs were in January. But what we have to do and how young people are organizing themselves with peer-to-peer conversations and using social media and educating themselves and keeping this administration, every other administration accountable to their issues that they promised, like loan forgiveness for student debt, like a minimum wage, like getting rid of the ban on trans folks in the military. All of that becomes part of creating an identity of voter and having young people believe that they can participate in this democracy and help determine some outcomes. My last comment on this, so you understand how important our work is to the promise of American freedom and American democracy. Young people turned out in record numbers. Not all young people did the same thing, and I hope we get a chance to talk about that. And they were able to determine so many outcomes on November 3rd. And obviously in Georgia, it was remarkable, the turnout of young people, particularly young Black people in the Georgia runoffs. And on January 5th, they had an opportunity to celebrate all the things that they had done and broken all these stereotypes. And what happened on January 6th? An insurrection and a big lie and an attempt to undermine and destroy the votes and not count the votes of young people and young Black people and young brown people and Black communities everywhere. And they were cheated of that moment to enjoy this. And so our work is important and heavy and with purpose, that we can't allow them to feel demoralized and not feel that this democracy can still work. Because all the work that they went in should be celebrated. This is a moment to still celebrate, even though people are there trying to undermine that. And that's what we're doing. We are keeping them and helping them keep each other engaged in these conversations. Because just like John Lewis, Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, James Earl Chaney, Henry D. and Charles Moore Case, just like how they, and Julian Bond, just like how they help move this country forward as young men and women, these young people are going to do that and are doing that right now.
Very good. That's a wonderful picture you've painted of the work, but more importantly, the urgency of what's happening, and that the work that was inspired from the summer of '64 to where we are today, like you say, so much has happened, but yet there are so many barriers that are still there. I want to talk a little bit about and ask Nancy, our next speaker, to jump in on video. Terrific. Hey, Nancy. And talk a little bit about the work that you do with Tufts and how you rely on them, because they are the be all end all, if I will, to brag a little bit on Nancy's work of the data points and of the work that we can see sort of nationally. So can you talk about that relationship? And then Nancy, I'd love for you to jump in and wow us with some of the data that you've taken in over the years.
Sounds good. So do you want Maxim to talk about how he uses our materials, or do you want me to talk about how we adore Maxim and the Andrew Goodman Foundation? Because I can tell you that it is a wonderful partnership, and we really relish it. So
why don't you take the screen, Nancy?
All righty. All right. Okay. Sounds good.
Our work could not be done without the work of Tufts and what Nancy does. So it's a mutual love affair here.
Well,
Perfect.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I'm so grateful to you all for inviting me to do this. This is a wonderful opportunity. First of all, I would like to second everything that Maxim has just said. If you think back to the Freedom Summer and that summer of the Selma March, Selma to Montgomery, and that bloody day, and there were just so many crises. And what happened in response was really a bipartisan support for expanding voting rights. And it was stunning. It wasn't just expanding voting rights for people of color, although that was a very large part of it. But we saw legislation to lower the voting age, to let young people vote. We saw that was an amendment to the Constitution, of course. We saw laws that enfranchised people with disabilities, people for whom English was a second language. All of these efforts to expand voting rights were bipartisan. And they were in response to a crisis. And it was a crisis that involved a lot of sacrifice, particularly on people of color and those who were involved in that Freedom Summer. So what I think is so stunning about this era is that we are seeing what I would consider a partisan divide over voting. And it's something that I personally am having a lot of trouble understanding. So let's just talk about the numbers for a little bit. As you mentioned, Patrick, we run a voting study on college student voting. Interestingly, we don't have data before 2012 because frankly, it couldn't be done. And the reason the study couldn't be done is there weren't good data sets. If you look in the voter rolls, there's no category for students versus young people. And there are some myths around college students that we probably need to bust, such as not all college students are young and not all college students reside on campus. In fact, a very small percent, around 20%, reside on campus. 44% of college students attend community colleges. Many commute, and about 85% of students attend school within the state where they grew up. So some of the images of students running off to college and packing their bags and living in a dormitory and hanging out on the quad just isn't the real life of college students right now. They're busy people and they care a lot. They care a whole lot. So there is, I think, a little bit of myth busting to be done. That said, when we started our study in 2012, we were finally able to do what we do, which is marry enrollment records and voting records. Voting records are public. Now, how you vote is not public. I can't look up Maxim and say, oh, Maxim, I didn't like who you voted for, because that's not a matter of public record. But what is a matter of public record is the fact that you did vote and where you voted. And there's some demographic information on voter rolls that also exists on enrollment records. And so what we've been able to manage to do is combine those. And we do it in a way that protects student privacy, which I can talk about, but we don't know any student names. And then we could tell campuses individually on campuses what their voting rates were. So we provide every participating campus with a tailored report that says this is how many of your students were eligible to vote. This is the percent that voted. Here's the percent that registered. And here's a percentage of those who registered who then turned out to vote. And that was an eye-opener for a lot of the people of the world of people who care about this, because voting is correlated with education. The more educated you are, the more likely it is that you vote. And I think there was an assumption that college students voted. And so when we came out with the data for 2014, which is a midterm election and happens to be the lowest voting rate in the recent history, about the past 50 years for all Americans, and found that only 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted. That was a wake-up call. I had one campus tell me that they threw out their report because the numbers were so low, it couldn't possibly be true. So we know that it was a real eye-opener. The other thing that we were able to do is we were able to isolate certain demographic groups and display for the higher education community where these gaps are and what gaps need to be closed. But in that story is also some really great news, and I think it goes to Maxim's sort of story of growing empowerment. And that is that women vote at much higher rates than men on college campuses, and either women of two races or women, Black women vote at the highest, consistently the highest voting rates on campus. They are empowered, they are motivated, and they are setting records. So to some extent, when we say, let's close some gaps, we're actually saying to some groups, you got to catch up with the women of color on the campus. So those are just a few things. I think I would just close by saying that voting rates in 2018 doubled, more than doubled from 2014. I think that there were a combination of factors in place that caused that exponential leap. Nobody was expecting that leap. One was that it was a referendum on the Trump administration, and young people, through other studies, not our own, do not support the President Trump as much as older generations. And it also, I think, was a reflection of this big wake up that I saw happening institutionally on college campuses. And then there are these civic organizations like the Andrew Goodman Foundation that are working to train activists. And our other research, we study all sorts of things about campus involvement, everything political on college campuses. And our research shows that students are interested in issues and they are activists. And so some of the things that the Andrew Goodman Foundation taps into are exactly what our research shows.
If I may, thank you, Nancy. So I just want to underline a couple of things that Nancy said. We tap into this research because it helps us refine what we do. So one of the things, as we saw, we can see which groups are not voting, are not registering, even by major. STEM students versus political science students, or English students, or history students. And we could really target in that kind of granular way to convince STEM students that they have a voice and their concerns can also be met in some way by voting and participating in our democracy. And we also can understand that young people are not monolithic. So there's one thing that Nancy said that I do have to nuance, Nancy. There's a belief that young people are more progressive, and that may be true, and that, as you said, there was a referendum on Trump, but Georgia, not true. And here's what's not true from the data that I've seen. It is true that as a group of young people, the majority of young people voted for Joe Biden, or for Raphael Warnock, or for Joe Ossoff. Mm-hmm. However, Black youth voted over 90%, over 90% for those candidates. The majority of white youth voted for Donald Trump, voted for Loeffler, and voted for Perdue. Let me repeat that. Right? It is an average, but when you debunk the average, you actually see that a majority of white youth in Georgia did vote for Donald Trump. 62%. Over 50% voted for Loeffler, and over almost 60% voted for Perdue. And so we have to, if you're progressive, so we are nonpartisan, we do not endorse a party or any candidates, etc. But we are progressive to the extent that people think that all of a sudden it's progressive to actually love democracy. And we think it's progressive to want to have people register to vote. And it's progressive to allow them to vote and not impose voter suppression tactics, because that's a conversation now which is so awful and un-American. But Nancy's research and other organizations within Tufts, like Circle, help us to refine and target. And so, and this targeting is really important. When you think that Joe Biden won Georgia by only 12,000 votes, think about that. That's like one campus, maybe a dorm, or a set of dorms in these places. And so we are now really able, and you see the growth of the Andrew Goodman Fund. This is my last point on this. You know, a few years ago, so Nancy talked about 2012, this foundation was barely over $100,000. We had a spectacular chairman of the board, and not related to Andrew Goodman, Edwin A. Goodman, but no relation, no blood relation to Andrew, but he's the chairman of the board. And one of the things that he points out is we saw 150% compound interest growth in our revenue. When I joined, I'm in my 5th year of the foundation, we were barely about $400,000 when I joined. We're over 4 million, over 4 million today. 4 million, and that allows us to do the kind of work and be laser focused on what is happening to young people and young people of color, and be able to use Nancy's data, which should be funded, and so should we, so that we can actually uphold our democracy and have young people play the rightful role that they should in our democracy.
Well, I really appreciate that, what you just clarified, because of course there are regional differences in how people vote and what the split is. And it certainly is also true that we saw a modest but noticeable jump in white male voters in 2016. We don't have our 2020 data yet because we're still waiting for these voter rolls to be firmed up. But we're also a little bit concerned about 2020 because there were some other conditions in play that we think could negatively affect student voting. So voting is very complicated. And I also want to go back to one other point that Maxim said earlier, and that is there is active suppression against college student voters. I suspect that some of that effort is because it is a growing diverse population. And there are just longstanding efforts to stop certain demographic groups of Americans from voting. But college students face really strange barriers to voting around IDs, around proving their residency, about their mobility. I mean, students, if there is a primary in the beginning of September, there are some states that will say, well, you can't participate in the primary because you just arrived on campus 6 days ago. You know, even though they've been there before, they have the right to vote from campus. So there are real active efforts. I think there are also efforts in play to try to expand voting rates. But certainly the changes that were put in place to accommodate COVID and allow for mail-in voting, ballot boxes, drop boxes, all of those things that really made voting more convenient, I think contributed to the large jump in voting rates that we can see among the national population, but also what I think we will see in college student voting.
And I'd like to bring in someone who can talk about this first person. Tamia, gosh, I've done it twice now. It's terrible. I apologize. Tamia is joining us from Wisconsin and can talk about whether the youth are monolithic, whether there are barriers on campus. And so please jump into this. There are a lot of things being talking about you in the third person. So tell us what you're seeing and what your experience is as a campus ambassador, and obviously the work that you're done and what you care for.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Tamia Folks. I'm a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm an Andrew Goodman Ambassador and the Big Ten Voting Challenge intern for the Morgridge Center of Public Service, which is our public service center at the University of Wisconsin. And I work to mobilize and excite student voters who are certainly not a monolith, I don't think. One of the most exciting things that we were able to do this year was really try to alter our strategy to adjust to the many ways that students were tackling voting barriers this year. And there were a lot that were opposed to students on campus. I remember so vividly leaving campus in March, March 13th actually, and we had a voting event on campus just the week before, registered about 150 students to vote at 4 campus locations. They were all so excited, they felt so informed. We really had felt like we had done a really important and critical job in making sure that students had all of the things that they needed to go and vote on April 7th, which was when our election was happening. And then so quick, in just a few days, we were sent off of campus. A bunch of students were sent all across country when they were awaiting absentee ballots in the mail or just planning to vote in person and really questioning whether or not they would be able to cast their ballot for the people who would ultimately represent them in the state for the rest of the year and for the rest of their time on campus, depending on how long the term was. And so for us, it was really important to not only, provide resources for these students to have access to the ballot and make sure that they knew what was going on, but also to make sure that we weren't losing people and, having people disengaged because they were displaced. They were feeling extremely hopeless given the circumstances of what was happening in the world around them and just really nervous about what was coming next. And so that's just a little bit of the work that I've done over the past few months, and of course, more work into the 2020 presidential election as well. But that was kind of the setup for the situation that we were in coming onto campus this fall.
So let me just follow up because I'm sure your fellow panelists have lots of questions for you as well. So the National Archives just spent the last 2 years celebrating the 19th Amendment and the voice, the 70 plus years it took for women to get the right to vote. Some argue even longer than that. One of the things that we would remind people is it wasn't just, well, we want the right to vote, but it was about the issues. They had a voice that they wanted to contribute on the direction of policies and issues. So can you talk to us a little bit about, in your experience on campus, what are the issues that are driving students to register, to vote, as you're having your conversations?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you bring up the 19th Amendment. That was certainly something that was a focal point for my understanding of why I cared about voting so much and attachment to the civil rights movement. Of course, I went to an all-girls school. My introduction into politics was through a program called Badger Girls State and Girls Nation as well, where I met John Lewis during that week. During that program, we did a mock government trial where all of the girls who were participating in the program were senators, and we wrote legislation and presented them to our legislators and just got really involved. And so I think, first of all, the thing that young people care about the most is feeling like they can see themselves reflected or actually in the spaces that are, having change happen in them. And for me, that was a really pivotal moment. I don't think I've ever been more civically engaged than I was at the age of 17, walking around the Capitol and recognizing, all that was happening in the world around me. I think it's easy to disassociate for a lot of young people with the things that are happening in Washington, or even for me down the street at our state capitol. It's literally like 5 blocks away from me. And a lot of students still can't connect those issues to the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And I think for us, the big emphasis that we place on the things that happen in our everyday lives, the ways our communities are zoned, the way that our elected leaders represent and speak about the issues that we experience on campus on a day-to-day basis, that's all directly correlated to how we go out and vote. And it's a critical way to make our voices heard. And for us, the issues that a lot of students care about are things like the environment or things like racial justice. And this summer, especially, finally having a recognition that a lot of these issues, the murder of George Floyd, for example, that was emotionally impacting a lot of their peers. And being able to tie that connection to someone that for a lot of people, I think really energized them and got them involved and excited and ready to make their voices heard through their vote. If that was the only way they were going to do it, then they were going to make sure that it happened.
So, and I sense that Maxim might have a thought on this or two, but so obviously COVID was a major moment in terms of momentum from the spring, the summer, the fall. People are on campus, they're not on campus, all of that. What role would you say that the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd protests, the social justice, racial justice conversation, which went, just to the top for months and leading up to this election, did you see that through your work? And then, I don't know, Maxim, if you want to talk sort of nationally what you saw across the campuses in the network.
Absolutely. I think the one thing that is really overwhelming at times and also energizing for young people is the concentration of horrible events that we've witnessed in our lifetime or just over these past few months. I think nobody anticipated in April being either in or watching, 2-hour, 5-hour long lines of people just waiting to cast their ballot to vote under the threat of a pandemic that could literally kill them. I stood in line for my grandfather for the election in April because I was afraid that he was going to get sick. There were a lot of people who feared for their family every time they left the house, and that alone, and recognizing that we could have been in a better place if we had leaders who were willing and able to address those types of issues. I think, that was easily something that young people could attach to their votes, to their ballot, and to every conversation that they were having with their families and friends that made it a lot easier to tie those issues together. But the Black Lives Matter movement, especially whether people were supporting it or not, as they should, I think really just awakened a lot of people to recognizing that these issues are not so far away from us. When protests are happening outside your window, when you can hear people yelling and shouting on the street, it's really hard to ignore that. And I think when you are granted that opportunity to consider, okay, how is this affecting me and why is it not affecting me? That is really critical in shaping someone's understanding of an issue. And for us, I think that was a really critical and important factor in shaping a lot of students' understanding of Black Lives Matter, of how to advocate for their peers and how to use their vote, not only to speak for themselves, but to consider their community and the broader world and use that as a tool.
Maxim, did you want to add?
So here is the counterintuitive or the paradoxical thing about this moment and the pandemic pause. So Tamia mentioned sort of cascading horribles. So it's like the plague, the Great Depression, and the Civil War is happening all at the same time for Tamia, for all of us. I didn't make that up, by the way. I mean, that was Professor Andrea McAvoy Sparrow's framing, and it's brilliant. And Tamia was in Milwaukee. She's talking about when she had to stand in line for her dad, who had just undergone surgery. And remember what happened in Milwaukee, sort of the evil of what happened during the primary and thereafter, where they were forcing people to go out in person to vote. They reduced from 150 polling sites, which they normally have, for about 500,000 people, to 5. 5. That's the kind of stuff. But here's what I mean by the pandemic pause that is so counterintuitive. Tamia's friends, peers, the folks who would normally just see her in a particular light if she were living on campus, their classes are all remote. And they, like, I'm sure this is happening to all of us who are watching this. They're seeing people in their homes. They're seeing multi-generational families. They're seeing parents or children be sick, often from surgery. They're seeing all of this happening in real time. And I think it allowed for an awakening, just the way that we saw the horror of those people, those police officers kill George Floyd. And they could see it in real time. And so you didn't have to translate. They could see Tamia having class at her home. Her parents had this wonderful little restaurant. And they could see her in line. And that allowed an awakening for young people to realize that they're not all privileged. They're not all protected from what's happening. Some of them could be in a food truck with their family while they're doing classes, and some of them could be on the Maine coast in a mansion. And that was an incredible sharing of information and stepping into each other's moccasins. That would have been hard in other places. And I think that created what Tamia is saying, a kind of momentum, a kind of identification with someone else who lives a different kind of life. And that's where we were so nimble. There was a thought, Patrick, and I think that Nancy could speak to this too, that what could organizations like ours do if you could no longer do table tenting or knocking on dorm doors because students were all relocated away from their campuses? And this actually provided an opportunity for us to actually share some pilot programs that we had developed over the last couple of years, like texting, like a student voter portal called My Vote Everywhere, where we could actually encourage students and help universities like the University of Wisconsin-Madison and like other campuses in the entire University of Wisconsin system, and Bowling Green University and Stony Brook and so many, to communicate and keep up the momentum of civic engagement for young people having these conversations. And I would say that because you were trapped at your home, you had a captive audience and they could see in real time assassinations of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's horrible death at the hands of police. They could see Tamia having to navigate with parents that were vulnerable, the way the disproportionate number of African Americans are vulnerable to this COVID-19 and still being able to vote. And that made all the difference. And her spirit, the joy that she brings to this work, given the cascading crises that she's facing, is a testament to why I'm so optimistic about young people. It is incredible. It is incredible the work that Tamia has done. It is incredible ambassadors in Georgia, what they did. Now just think about one other myth busting. This is my last myth busting for you, Patrick. They used to say, young people and young Black people don't turn out, but they certainly don't turn out for a runoff. After the presidential election, the prediction was they will never turn out to vote in the Georgia runoffs on January 5th. Here's what was remarkable, folks. More Black youth, 25% of the Black youth who voted in the Georgia runoff hadn't even voted in the November 3rd. You understand that? They got more Black youth who hadn't even voted on November 3rd to vote on January 5th, 25%. That's an idea of how mobilized, how excited, and then how cheated they were by what the attempt was by the insurrectionists, the anti-Americanness of the attempted coup at the Capitol on January 6th. But to me, it gives me hope. I hope gives all of you hope and inspires the work that we're doing, because this is not a year to slow down. And I know I should be pitching, but folks, if we want to preserve our democracy, we need to fight all these voter suppression bills, and young people need to continue to believe that democracy will work and their votes and voices will be heard and counted. Thanks, Patrick. Tamia, you know how much we love all the work that you and your other ambassadors do. And thanks, Nancy.
They're the engine that makes it happen, I'm sure. So one of the things, and I've been pulling from the public Q&A as we've been going along here, so they are getting their voice into the mix. What about the political parties? Do you think they're going to look at these trends and say, we need to engage with campuses differently? If you could prognosticate, what do you think about that?
They better have. They better have. And this goes for all political parties, the two main ones and any other ones that are there. We cannot have young people be betrayed by an insurrection or be betrayed from the promises that were made to them. There were promises made that must be kept. If we are going to see momentum, and if we're going to see momentum of young people being engaged. And so I believe if people are serious about our democracy and serious about respecting the vote, the things that Tamia said, that, police brutality, student debt. Evan Marlborough in Georgia, our wonderful ambassador now, one of our Puffin fellows, talks about this. Student debt relief, gender, reproductive justice, climate change. These have to be addressed because those are things that young people said made them want to participate in our democracy. And if they're not, if those promises aren't kept, and then I think young people have a right to feel disheartened, but also hold them accountable, certainly in the next election. And I believe they will, right, Tamia?
Absolutely. I'm not sure exactly if, parties are the primary focus. It really doesn't matter what they do. Ultimately, I think the most important thing is people recognizing that it's even worthwhile to vote. We have a lot of students on our campus that I heard from personally who said, I don't know if I even know enough to vote. It really doesn't matter if we're deducing it all down to parties. I think people feeling like they are heard and like they're cared about is the most critical and important thing. And sure, parties can do that, but I think it really comes down to the infrastructure of our educational system about voting, about civic engagement. That's something that is not spoken about often in grade schools. I don't think that I should get to be 18 years old and then not know how to register unless somebody else tells me how to. It should be something that's, integral in our educational system. And it's, something that we've tried to do on our college campus is to institutionalize voting and to make, civic learning something that is a critical aspect of everything that we do on campus. It shouldn't just be something that we come back every 4 years and say, oh, hey, like, are you interested in, making sure that our government and our democracy is sound and that we don't have to worry about it every single time that someone gets a little bit stressed about politics. I think, people should be invested because that's what it should be. And they should know that from the beginning. And so for us, being able to have professors and faculty and staff work with us and invest in the idea that students should be getting out to vote, should be caring about these issues and finding ways to integrate that into their class lessons, into our social events, into everything that we do on campus, that's been the most important thing. And I don't think that it gets down to parties or candidates, but it really just gets down to people knowing that they can be heard and, creating pathways to do that.
That's terrific. And Nancy, I was just going to ask you, have you seen a perceived change from the institutions you work with as you send these reports out that they're not throwing in the trash anymore because there must be some sort of data error? But in fact, what's that dialogue?
The dialogue is, oh my gosh, look at these numbers. What do we do? And that's exciting. That's a great change in attitude on the part of faculty, institutional leaders. Students are all, they're ahead of the curve. They're ready to do this. It is convincing faculty, for example, across disciplines, that discipline is relevant to the future and health of democracy. It's helping them understand how to have conversations that are political, but not partisan. Too often the term political and partisan are used interchangeably. They should not be used interchangeably. And in fact, to talk politics is the job. It's actually why they have academic freedom. So there are a lot of things that need to happen. We, as I mentioned briefly earlier, we've been studying campuses with crazy high voting rates, and we have put out materials to campuses that go to these issues of what can faculty do, what can presidents do. It takes the whole campus to get to, I think what Tamia has been describing, which is, it's in the water here. It's kind of what we do. And that's a paradigm shift. I think it's a paradigm shift for Americans, frankly. And what I'd like to see is campuses becoming little mini publics, little mini microcosms of a democracy done well, so that they can share what they're doing well with the rest of the community. Because frankly, Americans don't vote. They voted in 2020, but generally they don't vote. We are 26th in a ranking of 32 global democracies in terms of our voting rate. So there's a lot of work to be done on campus, but there's a lot of work to be done off campus. So I'm very excited about the work that Tamia is doing, because I think it's going to raise the bar for the other people on campuses. At some point, presidents are going to have to say, our students are very serious about this. We're going to have to take it seriously too.
So
absolutely.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I have to share a concern though. I love Nancy's optimism and bright view. So here's where she says, and I think she's right, there may be, the academy may look at this in this positive way. And they should, like E.D. Goldenberg at University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, who created the Big Ten Challenge. However, Georgia, 50 bills to suppress the vote, targeting people of color and young people, to over 250 across the country. So there's also the reverse happening. The legislature, mostly GOPs, if not exclusively GOPs, are targeting the good results to undo them, to make sure that young people and others can't vote in 2022. And so, Julian Bond, when I was NAACP, he was the chairman, used to say, when Barack Obama got elected, we're going to see the Barack Obama backlash. And this is based on his experience. Jim Crow, Reconstruction, as always. We have to make sure that these wrongdoers, these bad actors, don't try, because they are trying, but don't succeed in ending the momentum that Nancy and Tamia are talking about, because they're doing their darnest to try to stop it. You know, you got to think, I hope the power that I mentioned, right, where citizen young people could identify with non-citizen young people, the DACA young people, the immigrant young person, and that's why we have that issue that they're concerned about what happens to immigration reform, because they can step in those shoes. But let's understand, there are bad actors afoot, exponentially. You want to understand what I'm trying to say, right? If last year was the year for voter suppression, and now we are over 50 times more voter suppression laws trying to be passed around this country than 2020. I am worried, Nancy. So yes, and there's a climate of fear. I hear when I chat with presidents and chancellors, you remember we have 93 campuses. They're afraid. They're afraid. And there are certain states that have passed laws that campuses cannot engage in voter registration. No faculty, no worker, even a person on financial aid who's doing work study can't do this, because it's an effort to restrict it. And so we have to be very, very cautious that and deliberate in empowering young people like Tamia, who aren't paid by the university unless she has a job there, to be free, to keep the pressure on, because states are trying to stop this work and stop Tamia and stop Nancy and a lot of other people. I'm not speaking for you, Nancy, but you know what I'm speaking in general, from doing the important work that they have to do.
So I really want to follow up on that point, because it's just so critical. What is happening right now is a lot of good work by people like Tamia and Maxim and our office and you all for hosting this. But there are too many millions, tens of millions of Americans who are looking the other way. They may say, we're not white nationalists. We're not the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. We're not the ones who did this, that, and the other thing. We're not the ones wearing Confederate flags. We're not the ones wearing anti-Semitic T-shirts. But they have to stop looking the other way, because this is a force. And one thing that AGF and my office did together was we issued a memorandum to college presidents asking them to use their stature in the states as leaders in the state to fight voter suppression and ensure that students were not being deprived of their civil right to vote. This is a role that college presidents need to play. And it is one of many roles. This is the role of public scholars. This is the role of faculty. They should be standing up. They need to be visible and loud and say, everybody has to get a little NIMBY about it. Not in my backyard am I going to allow people to take over our democracy, destroy it, and run it like some kind of authoritarian state. I'm just not going to allow it. And I think that's what Tamia, she's planting the seeds. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're planting the seeds.
Well, this is when we were starting to get a little over time here, but I am going to give her the last word. I have two questions for you as last word. One coming in from 3 elementary age students who are watching. They're curious what you would advise them to do to get involved now.
That's wonderful. I love that there are elementary kids watching this. To get involved now, I would just say, first of all, start having conversations with each other about what is going on in the world, what issues matter to you, because there are certainly so many, I'm sure. And find individuals who inspire you, who make you feel empowered to join in this type of work. You can't vote yet. It's going to be a little bit of time before you can. But when you turn 16, you can volunteer at your polls. You can also just read the news and try to educate yourself about what's going on in the world. I grew up reading Teen Vogue when I was about 11 years old. I absolutely love that magazine. There are plenty of resources for young children to get involved in things that are talking about voting and about how to make a difference in the world. There are activists like Greta Thunberg who care about the environment. You could do a community garden. You could do working at a homeless shelter, trying to serve people in your community, help them have access to food, because all of those issues ultimately are a byproduct of the way that older people like me and generations ahead of me have shaped the world, and we have to fix it. We have to make sure that everybody has access to resources that will help them live happy, healthy, fulfilled lives, that they can have access to education. You can read to people who are younger than you, help them become more literate, enjoy the stories that you enjoy. There are so many ways to get involved that really do play a critical role in shaping the world as we want to see it. There's so much to do. And that could be small things like recycling a water bottle, or, talking to a legislator in your state. I think there's so much to do and you're never too young to do it. And I'm so excited that you're here. So I hope that answered your question. And if you want to get involved, you could probably Google me and I'll help you.
That's awesome. That is a terrific way to close. And I'm going to ask a question that nobody's asked, but everyone's thinking, when will we see your name on the ballot?
I am a journalist first. I care about the news and making sure that other people know what is going on in the world. That's my passion. I have a podcast called Podcast Your Vote, where we talk about issues that young people care about and try to help them apply those skills to real life and voting. And so for me, I want to make sure that other people are informed. I don't necessarily have to be on your ballot, but who knows what will happen one day. But right now, I just want to make sure that everybody can engage and be a part of the conversation. And that's what is most critical to me.
That's terrific. We had the great Cokie Roberts on our board until she passed, and I know she would be inspired by what you're doing. And you gave a very politician answer there at the end. Who knows? So we'll put a pin in that one. Maxim, Nancy, Tamia, God, Tamia, I am going to get this right. When we do the second version of this, I will get it right every time. I want to thank you guys for your time, your energy, your leadership. It's really been wonderful. And we look forward to having you back in the future, because the democracy is not every 4 years, it's 365. So I want to thank you for all the energy that you put into it. And I'm just going to close out with a couple of last things. So again, thanks to our speakers. We want to thank obviously our sponsor, Ford Motor, and all the supporters and donors who helped us get through all of the things we're getting through today. If you're interested in membership, you can check out archivesfoundation.org and follow us and learn more about membership. And as you know, we've got a lot of exciting things going on at the National Archives, none of which is more important at the moment than our online store, nationalarchivestore.org. A lot of history-related products that might interest you. Go check us out. And my retail director told me today they're about to launch a new sale, so you never know what's going to be there with a little bit of extra discount. Coming up, I want to talk to you about a couple of programs we have in March. We're going to continue our Presidential Library series with the Truman Presidential Library on March 10th. And then on March 31st, we will be having our First Ladies who risked their lives for civil rights, featuring Diana Carlin, Anita McBride, Nancy Keegan Smith. They're going to examine the complicated history of First Ladies on civil rights. You can learn more about these programs, follow us on social media, or go to our website to check out our emails. The National Archives is our nation's memory. What is past is prologue. So on behalf of the National Archives Foundation, thanks for joining us today.